Okay, thank you very much, Antonio, for this introduction, and thanks to everyone for inviting me to present. It's kind of really great to give this talk at a conference on general linguistics because I've recently written a paper on generative linguistics, general linguistics, and reflected on how general relates to theoretical linguistics. So that's very appropriate. And unfortunately, I cannot see the audience really, but I see some names. Carlos Moreno seems to be in the audience, and he was sort of one of my heroes when I studied typology in the late 1980s. So one very important paper on anti-causatives, I remember, and we met at a number of very nice places in the early 1990s. So a special hello to Juan Carlos, but also everyone else, of course. Okay, so my talk has the following main points. I asked, do general linguists need to be organized in competing communities? And my tentative answer is no. Instead, linguists could think of their methodological choices as complementary. And I would like to argue that there are in fact 8 different theoretical questions of general linguistics, which are as complementary as Tinbergen's famous 4 why questions in biology. So let's start with the idea of community organization of linguistics. I think everyone knows about this, but we rarely talk about it. So linguists often belong to particular communities. They used to be called school, like Prague School, or Leningrad Phonological School in the early 20th century, or Columbia School of Functional Linguistics, but they're more often called frameworks these days. So there's systemic functional grammar and role reference grammar and head-driven phrase structure grammar and so on. Everyone knows about these. Linguists also often come together at conferences around these communities, and some of them are very big, like GLOW or usage-based linguistics, or they have funny acronyms like ICLA or ICCG. And these communities are often based on pedigrees. So HPSG, that's Ivan Sag and his students, LFG, Joan Bresnan and her students, FDG, Simon Dick and his students, and so on. So the nice thing about a conference on general linguistics is it's not based on pedigrees and it's not based on communities. It's just general linguistics. So I really like this conference. Often these communities also describe their orientation in ideological terms. So they talk about commitments or tenes. Authors often say that they subscribe to a particular view, or that they reject a view, or that they adhere to a view, or they're affiliated with, these kind of family metaphors. They're wedded to something, that adopt an approach, and so on. Sometimes linguists also divide linguistics into relevant or irrelevant parts. So Hornstein has this distinction between linguistics and linguistics. So he says the kind of really interesting questions are the linguistic questions, and then studying languages, that's not really so relevant to the really interesting questions of linguistics. So one often gets the impression that these communities compete with each other. Instead of competing hypotheses that can be distinguished by data, we seem to have competing ideologies or competing communities where persuasion and rhetoric are more important than data. Now, is this ideology or community-based organization somehow a necessary feature of linguistics? You might say, well, that's just human. Humans organize in groups. We're not individuals. You want to belong to a group. So maybe that's just the way it has to be. But I would like to suggest that no, linguistics could be reunified. In fact, it wasn't organized in these communities until the 1960s. So, there could be a reunification. There are no unsurmountable ideological differences because we all respect the basic principles of science and rationality. I mean, in politics, it's different. Politics is about dividing power, but linguistics and science in general is about finding the truth. So we don't need political parties or communities of this sort. We may differ in methodological choices, of course, including terminological choices, And we must always be open to other choices in methodology or terminology. So I've thought a lot about terminology in particular because of this experience of talking past each other. And so in the next section, I would like to highlight two important terminological points. First, that theoretical linguistics contrasts with applied linguistics. So if you're not an applied linguist, you're a theoretical linguist. So, if you want to understand the world, if you ask why questions, that's theoretical linguistics. If you want to change the world, well, then you're an applied linguist. But there are many different theoretical linguists, and I'm going to talk exclusively about theoretical linguistics here, no applied linguistics. Now, within theoretical linguistics, general linguistics contrasts with particular linguistics. General linguistics is a study of human language in general. Particular linguistics is a study of a particular language or a language family, historical entity. So this means it makes no sense to contrast descriptive versus theoretical, because all descriptive linguistics is necessarily theoretical, all typological linguistics. So very often, since the 1960s and 70s, the term theoretical has been actually used in the sense general theoretical. So if you take a dissertation title like Walbery Theoretical Implications, that actually means Walbery General Implications. Walbery is a small Australian language, and the author, Julianne Leggett, wants to say that the study of Walbery has general implications on the study of human language in general. Of course, it's theoretical. It's not an applied work. Her purpose is not to teach Walbery to foreigners or something like that. Okay, so now we have established what I mean by theoretical here. We can get to Nicolaas Tinbergen. Tinbergen was a really famous biologist in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He got a Nobel Prize for physiology. And in 1963, he was trying to unify behavioral biology. And he said, actually, there are four different and complementary why questions of behavioral biology. There's a mechanistic question, how does it work? For example, birdsong. I think he was studying birdsong in particular. So what is the mechanism that birds use when they sing? The ontogenetic question, how does birdsong develop in individual birds? How do they come to know how to sing? There's a functional question, what is the survival value of the bird song? And finally, there's a phylogenetic question, how did it evolve? And Tinbergen was noticing that some of his colleagues were interested more in the ultimate questions, the functional and the evolutionary questions, and others were interested more in the mechanistic and the ontogenetic question. I think Tinbergen was from the continent, from the Netherlands, and he was sort of more in the Konrad Lorenz approach, so he was kind of more interested in the evolutionary questions. But others, people in Britain, where he worked later, were more interested in the proximate question. And then Tinbergen said, hey guys, stop arguing. What you're doing is completely complementary. These four questions are not in competition with each other, but they're complementary. For a complete explanation, we need to answer all of them. So, and I would like to argue that in linguistics, we should also accept explanatory pluralism or theoretical pluralism as a foundational principle. Different theoretical questions coexist and have answers at different levels of analysis, and they're not easily reducible to the others. The questions complement each other. There's space for different methods and different sub-communities in the field whose approaches are not necessarily in tension. So the communities could study particular questions, but not start out from commitments or so. So a theoretical question, as I already said, is a question about the general question about explanation. And we can ask such questions either about particular languages or human languages in general. So that's different from biology, right? In biology, we don't we don't have this cultural dimension, the level of particular cultures. So the general level and the particular level, I sometimes call that G linguistics and P linguistics to make clear that this is an important distinction. This means that in linguistics, we actually have 8 questions. So the 4 questions can be called the mechanistic, the ontogenetic, the functional, and the phylogenetic question. And we can ask this question both at the P level and at the G level, the level of particular language and the general level. So how does a particular language work? How is a particular language acquired by its speaker? So take English, right? How does English work? How is English acquired? What are the functions of English grammar? How did English arise? And just to highlight that linguists have been asking these, here just some famous names. So Chomsky, 1957, how does English work, right? Syntactic structures of English. Jean Berko, how is English acquired? Michael Halliday, what are the functions of English grammatical features? How did English arise? Rasmus Rask was perhaps the first to sort of clearly state that English was a Germanic language and went back to Proto-Germanic, and then that was part of Proto-Indo-European and so on. But of course, there are many other names. I'm just giving these to highlight, some famous P linguists. So there are also 4 questions about human language. So after the P questions, let's look at the G questions. So how does human language work? How does language in general grow in children? How is language in general adapted to the needs of the users? How does language change and evolve? So importantly, these questions, the G questions, are related to the P questions, but the P questions are often independent of the G questions. So, Rasmus Rask, didn't have to answer the question how languages change in general to find out about the history of English. Or, in syntactic structures, Chomsky wrote a generative grammar of English. You don't really need a general theory of grammars in order to describe English linguistics. So it's an interesting question how these G questions can be answered on the basis of knowledge on particular languages. I've reflected on this quite a bit, but so let's now look at these 4 G questions, but it's complicated because there are 2 types of G questions. We can ask a question about the biological capacity for language. We can ask the same questions about universal cultural properties because human language is a biocultural hybrid. So we can ask, how does the biological capacity for language work? The mechanistic question. How does it grow? The ontogenetic question. What is its survival value? The functional question. And how did the capacity for language evolve? The phylogenetic question. But we can ask quite analogous questions about universal properties. How do languages work in general? How are languages acquired in general? How are they adapted to their users' needs? And how do they change? So let's again put some salient names to these. So how does the capacity for language work? Biolinguistics. Lenneberg, 1967 was a foundational work. How does the capacity for language grow? Guasti, 2004, the growth of grammar. What is the survival value? Pinker and Bloom, 1990, is a famous paper that argued for biological adaptation of the biological capacity. How did it evolve? Well, Charles Darwin made some really interesting comments in his old book from 1871. Next, how do languages change in general? Hermann Powell, Principles of the History of Language. That was the first really groundbreaking book about language change, or one of the first. Then, how do languages work in general? Well, that's universals research by Greenberg and others. How are languages adapted to their users' needs? Gibbon and other functionalists have asked these general questions. And how are languages acquired? In the world's languages, Dan Slobin is famous for his work on the cross-linguistic study of language acquisition. So for all these questions, we have authors who have focused on them, and kind of linguists have addressed them, and they're all complementary. the point that I would like to, the main point that I would like to make. Okay, so let's take a concrete example now. Differential object marking in Spanish and in general. So, we can ask 12 different questions about differential object marking, right? 4 P questions and 8 G questions. So how does differential object marking work in Spanish? So look at Fabregas 2013, and he spends 45 pages explaining how it works. How is it acquired in Spanish? Well, there's work like Rodriguez Mondoñedo, for example, and surely a lot more. What function does it have in Spanish? Well, for that, I didn't find a paper, but my colleague Ilya Sergeant has a nice recent paper from a 2018 Language Science Press book on the function of differential object marking systems. This paper is about Russian, but it's maybe similar in Spanish. How did it evolve in Spanish? Well, for example, Marco Garcia has a recent paper, also in a Language Science Press volume, on the diachrony of differential object marking in Spanish. And of course, there's a lot more work. I was just giving some recent examples. Next question, how does differential object marking work in the mind-brain? Well, Lopez, 2012, has some interesting hypotheses about this. This is mainstream generative grammar, and that's about, what are the mental representations? How is differential object marking acquired as a mental capacity? For that, I couldn't find any work. Also, what is the adaptive value of object marking in the biological capacity? Again, I couldn't give examples, let alone about the evolution of differential object marking. But the final 4 questions are sort of more, or at least some of them. So how does object marking work in languages worldwide? So Kaio Sinemaki has this nice paper on a worldwide study of differential object marking from 2014. And of course, there's the World Atlas of Language Structures. Here's a chapter by Bernard Comrie on object marking. How's object marking acquired? Well, again, question mark. I don't know of any cross-linguistic research, but it's just acquisition is just not my question. And the final questions are sort of really interesting for me. I've looked at them quite a lot. What is the general purpose of differential object marking? And so I'll talk about that in the next section. And how does differential object marking develop in general? I will also talk about that in the next section, but there's a really nice book edited by Ilya Sergeant and Alina Witzlak-Makarewicz on the diachrony of differential argument marking. So all of these things are being studied, and to a large extent, they're complementary. So in the next section, I would like to elaborate a little bit on the general purpose of differential object marking. And so now we're getting a bit closer to sort of actual questions of linguistics. I'm kind of moving a bit from these bigger philosophical questions to more concrete questions. I have a recent paper published in the journal Linguistics on differential object marking and all kinds of other phenomena of differential argument marking. So I have argued, not in an original way, but along with earlier authors such as Moravchik and Bossong, that languages tend to show extra marking when a semantic relationship is not readily predictable from other information, namely to serve as an efficient means of communication. So means of communication is efficient when the marking is used when it's particularly needed. So when the hearer can predict what the speaker wants to say, then the marking is not so important. Now, object marking is favored when the object nominal is definite or animate, and thus unexpected as an object. For an object, participant in a patient position, you expect it to be indefinite and inanimate. So when it's not, then there's this strong tendency for languages to mark it. And more generally, highly ranked roles tend to be filled by referentially prominent arguments. So agent and recipients tend to be animate, definite, topical, first and second person, and so on, and vice versa. Patients And themes in ditransitive constructions tend to be inanimate, indefinite, non-topical, and so on. So there's this very general association between role rank and referential prominence. So this is my paper, which is called Role Reference Associations and the Explanation of Argument Coding Splits. So it doesn't focus on any particular language. It's G-linguistics, right? It doesn't say anything about Spanish. It just talks about the generalizations of differential object marking, but it talks about even higher level generalization and all kinds of argument coding splits. So the next question is, how does differential object marking arise? And what we find is that object markers have a really very diverse range of diachronic sources. The Spanish a is, of course, derived from Latin ad, which was allative to marker or dative marker. The Russian differential object marker a comes from a genitive. In Afrikaans, the object marker vir comes from Dutch voor, which is for. In Batavia Creole, kung comes from Portuguese com, with. Persian ra comes from postposition, meaning concerning. Sri Lanka Malay yang comes from a relative marker. German n comes from a stem forming element. So it's a really curious diachronic source. So we have differential object marking in modern German, but in medieval German, the object marking was uniform. So it arose not by introducing a new distinction, but by abandoning a new distinction. So what exactly happened diachronically in these languages is not really clear, but the changes have yielded very similar analogous results in many different languages, apparently due to the same selective pressure. So that's like in biological evolution, where we get very similar development with wings developing in birds and bats and insects and flying dinosaurs. Of course, the mechanisms are very different in these different species, but it's the adaptive value, the selective pressure that leads to the changes. That's very similar in linguistics. So the evidence for functional adaptation is not found in the changes themselves, but the changeability of the linguistic conventions makes it possible for selective pressures to take effect. So I've argued in my 2019 paper that multi-convergence from different sources is evidence for adaptation. So I have argued that differential object marking in languages in general is adaptive, and that would be very compatible with a view that says that differential object marking also has this differentiating function in Spanish, for example. But maybe not necessarily. Maybe it's only in the diachronic evolution. Biologists often discuss the extent to which synchronic traits of biological organisms are synchronically adaptive, help the survival value, or were only driven in the evolution. And we have very similar questions in linguistics, and they cannot be easily resolved and must be sort of considered from very different perspectives. So I've argued that these efficiency considerations explain the worldwide distribution of object marking phenomena, and really quite importantly, this does not mean that the other theories must be wrong. So, for example, Lopez's theory of his generative theory about what's in the mind of Spanish speakers, right? That's in principle compatible. Okay, so just to recapitulate, we have these 12 questions. So actually, it's not 8 questions, but the general questions have these sub-questions. So there's really 12 theoretical questions of linguistics. So remember the mechanistic particular question, ontogenetic one, the functional adaptive, the phylogenetic P question, so on. So I just put them on a single slide here so that you remember that we have all these different theoretical questions and that they're in principle independent of each other and not reducible to the others, although of course it's often useful to consider other questions. So here under the general functional question, how are languages adapted to their users' needs? I put Georg Bossong, 1991. That's really a very beautiful seminal paper on differential object marking, really in the world's languages, but starting out from Romance, of course. Okay, so these questions are complementary, but why do linguists think that there should be community competition? So, let's get back to the original question that I asked about the way competition works in linguistics. I think that especially in research on grammar, there's a widespread stereotype that theoretical linguistics should be monistic instead of pluralistic. People often talk about linguistic theory, as if there were not many different theoretical questions that must be complementary, as if there were just one theory, and somehow you have to choose. And we often neglect the difference between general linguistics and particular linguistics. Many linguists try to answer general questions by using particular data. This is overly ambitious. So I think that's really a mistake. So, it's not a mistake to, adopt the Chomskyan perspective. It's a mistake to try and answer general questions by using particular data. So linguists also do not sufficiently try to use precise terminology. So many linguists think that what divides different groups ideologically is the belief in the language faculty or universal grammar. But what does this mean? These terms have been used inconsistently. So Chomsky 2000, for example, says, if you believe that there's a difference between my granddaughter, a rabbit, and a rock, then you believe that language is innate. There's no doubt that language is an innate faculty. Well, sure, there's a difference between humans and other animals, so we have a sort of innate capacity for language. So absolutely. But then he went even further. In 2019, Chomsky says, the term universal grammar is simply for this striking difference in the cognitive capacity between us and them, human and non-human animals. So UG is just a research topic of generative grammar. What is it? How did it evolve in us? So Chomsky starts saying that, all that generative linguistics is to be interested in, some of these G questions, as I call them. And of course, you can be interested in them, but that does not mean any sort of commitment to Chomsky's speculation about grammar. So Chomsky has used these terms in a kind of very funny way, and he used them very differently earlier. So it's very confusing. So I propose that it's better to use the term linguisticality for the biological capacity of language. So I have this paper in 2020 that Antonio Benitez Borraco invited me to submit to a special issue. And I think we should talk about the evolution of linguisticality when talking about Darwin's question. Because when we just talk about language evolution, then that may also mean cultural evolution, namely language change. So we should be clear about what we mean. There's no ideological question about linguisticality, as Chomsky says. There's only empirical questions. To what extent is linguisticality domain-specific? To what extent is it species-specific? Did linguisticality evolve by saltation or gradually? We ask the same questions for many types of biological traits of animals. So, and the term linguisticality actually was adopted from biomusicology. Many musicologists are asking biological questions. So, and musicality is generally recognized to be a biological capacity of humans. So I think we can talk about linguisticality in the same way. But answering these empirical questions is difficult. The consensus seems to be that we do not know very much about all of them, but still we can ask them and try to maybe approach them a little bit. So even though we know very little about them, there's this kind of really strange disconnect. Then we have textbooks like Kuhnemann and Zelstra about syntax, And Chomsky praised this textbook, a lucid introduction that leads carefully to substantial understanding of language and linguistics. Well, this book is sort of full of speculation, and almost nothing of what it says, is well established. And so there's this kind of really strange disconnect between these really deep questions that Chomsky keeps asking and the actual reality of way linguistics is presented to students. And that's, I think, something we should highlight. So the reality is we have all these different questions. It's sort of, many different methodological approaches to them. We cannot simply say that somehow speculative comments on linguistics, on syntax, give us progress. Okay, so now I don't see my slides anymore. What happened? Did I click on something? Sorry.
I will. Yeah, it's now okay. But you need to go to the
okay,
19. Wait a minute.
Sorry, it seems that I clicked on a different.
Yeah, no problem.
On the wrong button, so you will see.
Yeah, this is
the slides again.
Yeah.
Remind you of what I talked about, but we will soon be at the right slide where I got interrupted. Okay, so it's almost my last section, which again talks a bit more about generative linguistics. Because in my paper on general linguistics, which will appear soon in the journal Theoretical Linguistics, I highlighted this issue of second level analyses. And I think this is really the mistake of generative syntax. Many generative papers contain two levels of description, one in terms that are generally comprehensible, and a second time using a technical meta-language and extremely abstract concepts, and it's called theoretical analysis. So I again have this tree from Lopez here. Now in Fábregas, it's really a very nice paper. It gives an overview of differential object marking in Spanish, and it talks about its general properties, morphological properties, its meaning properties, telicity, syntactic properties, topicalization, and so on and so on. On 45 pages, Fábregas describes the various conditions on differential object marking in Spanish. And then in section 4, after spending 45 theoretical pages on Spanish, he comes to theoretical aspects. And apparently what he means is general aspects. And then he comes up with these very abstract trees. And now the question is, what does this second level of description, these extremely abstract concepts, what does this add? Well, I think what it adds is to sort of relate the G linguistics to P linguistics in a particular way. The technical meta-language, what's called the framework, is hypothesized to be innate, and by offering a second-level analysis of Spanish, it also provides support for a particular claim about the innate building blocks of grammar as part of human linguisticality. But if only one language, if only Spanish is considered, this is a very weak claim, because many other second-level analyses are possible. It would have to be shown that the same building blocks also work well for all other languages. Now, there's no reason to be ideologically opposed to this approach, so that's why I keep talking to generativists all the time. But it must be asked whether this one language at a time method is an efficient way of finding the innate building blocks. And Croft 2009 discussed this already in a very nice way. So I think that generative Chomskyan syntax is a methodological choice. It's not an ideology or a commitment. There's no reason to adopt or reject it wholesale, but its specific claims should be assessed in comparison with other methodological choices. Now, generative grammarians typically do not do this. So I have these blog posts. Antonio mentioned my blog recently, and I try to engage with generative linguists. And I try to, sort of ask them. So, what is the actual evidence beyond the particular things, the particular technical analyses that you propose? What predictions are you making? And sometimes I'm making some progress in talking to the generative linguists, but they prefer to stay in their own communities. So one nice thing was Ormazábal and Romero, 2019, have a recent paper which does compare their approach to functionalist alternatives. The paper is only limited to Spanish. How it might be extend to other languages is unclear, but at least they do compare their approach to the more functional adaptive approach that I have advocated. So I have this blog post here. I wrote to Ormazábal and Romero whether we could have some interaction, some kind of discussion on the blog or so, but they didn't have time so far. So, it's not that I reject generative approaches. I just find most of the work very narrow, limited to a few languages, and the claims are extremely difficult to test. It appears that many linguists conceive of the generative approach as the only possible one, maybe because they think of linguistics as monistic rather than pluralistic. So that's why I'm emphasizing this pluralism. But particular linguistics is theoretical on its own. So the 45 first pages of Fabregas's papers, it's a wonderful theoretical treatment of Spanish. So, no reason to say that that's not theoretical yet. And general linguistics must really be based on large-scale cross-linguistic comparison. Otherwise, it's very speculative. Okay, so I come to my conclusion slide where I just mostly repeat what I said. There are many different theoretical questions of linguistics that are complementary. There's no reason to say that description is not theoretical or that P-linguistics is somehow less worthy than G-linguistics. Different linguists differ in their methodological choices. There's no reason why this should define isolated community. A theoretical framework is a methodological choice, but without applying multiple converging methods, we will not know whether our theoretical claims are true. So it's not enough to work within a framework. So, if you think of different approaches in linguistics as being like different approaches in art, that occurred to me. We have all this romanticism, realism, impressionism, expressionism, cubism, isn't it wonderful to have all this diversity? Well, in art, pluralism is a goal in itself, l'art pour l'art. But in science, we want pluralism of complementary questions and methods. In science, we have a sort of monism of truth. It's just one truth, but multiple questions and multiple methods. One real problem in linguistics is that we often fail to understand each other. Talking past each other is a frequent experience. And this is sometimes due to simple vagueness of technical terms. So one way to improve the situation may be to raise awareness of terminological issues. And there's a sort of interesting, very recent paper by Levada and Murphy. They are more kind of generative Chomskyan linguists, but they kind of realize that there are sort of quite a few ambiguous or polysemous terms in linguistics. And I have sort of maybe even more ambitious forthcoming paper about a possible road towards standardization of morphosyntactic terminology for general linguistics. Okay, so this concludes my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for this interesting talk. Now we have some minutes for questions. It's easy to pose the question. I will open the microphone to anyone who is interested in asking Martin.
Is it possible to actually see the participants, the people who ask questions? Can you?
Yeah, sure. I will promote them to presenters, so they will be able to open the microphone and also to the video. So
I'm trying to open the microphones, but I can't get it. Just a moment, please. I'm looking for the way to do that. Oh no. I don't know what's the problem. Well, maybe Antonio, could you open the en ajustes? Could you open compartir audio and compartir video?
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, I will allow Xavier to ask a question because he's yes.
Oh, what's the problem with this? Okay.
Yeah, Xavier, now you can.
Thank you very much for your talk, Martin. It has been very interesting. Concerning this conversion strategy, you are talking about terminology, which is the site, but obviously for our theories to be, or analysis to be compatible with some kind of sharing standards, I think it's more or less the problem we have with these several platforms for hosting corporate. If you want them to communicate, we need some kind of standards for communication. You have talked about terminology, but which other standards should we share about, for example, experimental research? Which kind of do you have something else in mind for allowing us to compare our results and see a conversion point?
Well, yes, of course. The general problem of compatibility arises in quite a few domains. I was really talking about these higher level phenomena. I'm also concerned as a book editor, for example, with simple questions such as style sheets, right? I mean, it's sort of easier if we all use the same style sheet than if we kind of had to shift style sheets. So, we had proposed the Leipzig glossing rules for interlinear glossing, for typological works, for particular, and for corpus annotation, and there are all kinds of practical questions where it's easier if one has standards to share things. But one has to be careful, of course, that standards can also be perceived as something that imprisons our thoughts. So, I would like to caution. So, if the biologists have these Linnean way of identifying species with a genus and species names and so on, but some biologists say, well, actually a species is really population. We shouldn't think in essentialist terms like Linnaeus did. We should think of species in population terms. So, we should really avoid being in any kind of Procrustean situation. So I'm really happier to talk about terminology and these general questions at the higher level of bringing communities together, because this is something I find particularly painful, that my doctoral students have their abstract rejected because they don't use the generative jargon. There was a sort of recent conference on adjectives, and I have a doctoral student who wrote a brilliant dissertation on adjectives in the world's languages, and that would be really interesting for them. But she doesn't use the generative jargon, so that's not the way it should work. But otherwise, these practical questions, I think many people are aware of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you have questions, you only have to raise your hand in the chat, so I will open the microphone for you. Any other question? Comment? Criticism?
Objection?
Objections?
Protest?
Yeah, Angel. Go ahead, because you can.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So, Martin, thank you very much for this super interesting talk. I myself work within the generative approach, okay? But I do agree with you in that the different questions that you have offered are complementary. And actually, I mean, in connection with what Javier Villalba has said, I wonder if generative grammar is evolving into a more comprehensive and integrated theory of language in that we are incorporating many like functional based tools or methodology like experimental work. So I agree with you that we cannot work in isolation, and maybe we share more than we think at the first sight, okay? But I wonder if you have any thoughts about the common points where we all should meet, okay, according to the common goals that we all have when doing linguistics. That's my question and comment.
There's certainly a sort of big development in the last 10, 15 years that more and more people who are interested in grammar are doing experimental work. So there used to be, on the one hand, psycholinguistics, and on the other hand, non-psycholinguistics. Or, they used to use theoretical linguistics also, for non-experimental. Maybe like in physics, there's theoretical physics and experimental physics. But nowadays, it's really more and more merging. And more and more experimental work, and there's more and more awareness of the quantitative nature of our findings, and there's also more and more syntacticians in the Chomskyan tradition who adopt corpus-based methods because they've become so easy. So when Chomsky introduced generative grammar in the 60s and 70s, that was actually also an experimental approach. It was just sort of these micro experiments, right? So the acceptability judgments of the author of the paper, that was a kind of micro experimental approach. And now more and more linguists are using sort of a macro experimental, a kind of quantitative experimental approach. And the micro experimental approach, I think, that led people to some illusions because they thought that there was sort of a direct connection to what we have in our heads. People talked about introspection, as if we could look into our heads and see what our grammar is. And now, with the more broader experimental approaches, it's sort of clearer that different speakers have different reactions, and there's sort of more a sense of population thinking. So in that sense, I do think that there's kind of more convergence toward sort of general science approach, but I still see a lot of papers, especially in typology these days, actually. People who go to the field, to South America, to study small indigenous languages, they often think that for their analyses, they need to use these sort of really fancy and speculative Chomskyan approaches. And that's something that I still think is a real problem, and they because they cannot go to conferences where other people who work on the same languages go because they don't understand each other, and so on. So this failure to communicate to each other, I think, is still pretty big in many circles, and but hopefully it's getting better also because the methods, the experimental and quantitative and corpus methods, are more and more widespread. That's true. That's a reason for optimism.
All right. Thank you.
We have time for some other questions. Well, we have here a message by Matt. I think that you can read it.
Right, Matt Spike has a text in the chat. So he says that it's great that more traditional linguists are catching up with the interdisciplinary work that's been considering Tinbergen for a long time. I highly recommend you to check out Johansson 2013, Fitch 2010 books, and Spike 2017. Yeah, so I have to say at this point that Matt Spike, his paper on the evolution of linguistic rules, was one of the papers that served as inspiration for my work here, and also Tecumseh Fitch's work on evolution of language and music. So Fitch and Spike were really important inspirations for this. And there's also a recent forthcoming book by Arie Verhagen on what is it called? Evolutionary Approaches to Cognitive Linguistics or something like that, that also mentions Tinbergen. I don't know how Arie Verhagen got to Tinbergen, but for me, certainly Fitch and also Spike's work was quite important in discovering Tinbergen. And so in the written version of my talk, I will definitely refer to Matt Spike's work. So for those of you who don't know him, he's a linguist with a strong interest in biology, evolution, philosophy of biology, philosophy of evolution, and this sort of comparative work is also happening at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology here. So I've also learned quite a bit from being in some interaction with biologists here. And I think Matt is quite right, it's happening more and more in linguistics.
Okay, it's almost 11. We wish to thank you again, Martin, for this nice talk and also for the nice discussion. And it was great to have you here, even virtually, and next time we'll be in person. Well, I think that everyone in the room really enjoyed your talk. Again, thank you very much for coming, and we have. Okay. Robert, we can share. So you are kindly invited to join us during the rest of the conference. Thank you again for coming. Y bueno, al resto de los participantes tenemos ahora media hora de descanso y a partir de las 11:30, pues si habéis consultado el programa, empiezan las diferentes sesiones en las 5 salas que hemos habilitado. En 3 de ellas hay paneles temáticos y en las salas 2 y 3 hay conferencias o ponencias individuales. Entonces, bueno, tenéis el acceso en el programa y en función ya de vuestros intereses, pues vais conectando a una u otra. Hemos grabado la conferencia que ha dado Martín, le hemos pedido permiso y ya en su momento haremos público el vínculo por si alguien quiere escucharla de nuevo. Y el material que nos ha facilitado está ahí. Yo le pediré permiso también por si quiere compartir las diapositivas, que son, bueno, es más amplio que lo que ha compartido como Hangout y en fin, nos vemos entonces en media hora.